I am pleased to reach the introduction of our keynote speaker, a very good colleague of ours, who I had the pleasure of working with for a number of years at AUT, and who had a great deal to do with my understanding and execution of te reo, which is a work in progress, and was very patient with me. And so, Dr. Atakohu Middleton, it's a pleasure to introduce you. Atakohu is AUT alumna, as I've mentioned, and is a reo Māori journalist and communications advisor. She's recently published a non-fiction book, Kia Hiwa Rā, Māori Journalism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Atakohu's path to university study and eventually a PhD in Māori journalism was long, winding, and I think this is in her words, featured a few potholes, as they often do. This morning, Atakohu will share some of the things she's learned about life, doctoral study, and turning a PhD into a book in her aptly titled Keynote address, Insights from an Accidental Academic, What You Need in Your PhD Toolkit. Atakohu, it's a pleasure. Over to you.
Can everybody hear me? Lovely. Tuhia, ki te rangi tuhia, ki te whenua tuhia, ki te ngāko o ngā tāngata katoa, ko te mea nui, ko te aroha, tihei mauri ora e. Ka rere aku mihi ki a rangi nui e tui honei, kia papatua nuku e takoto nei, tēnā kōrua. Ka huri ki takaparawha ki ngā uri o tuputupu whenua, tēnā koutou katoa. Me mihi ka tika ki te kuini Māori a ngā waihono i te pō ka atahi anō ka eke ki te torona tapu o te kingitanga. Hai mārire. Kia tu heitia pōtatau te whirowhiro te tuawhitu ka atahi anō ka wehi atu ki ōna tūpuna. Me ngā mahi o te tau, o te marama, o te wiki, o te rā, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Rātau kia rātau, tātou kia tātou. Kia koutou kua hui hui mai nei I tēnei ata, anea mihi ka rere atu kia koutou katoa. Kia ora, my name is, as Nigel said, Atakohu Middleton. What you just heard was a traditional greeting in te reo Māori, the first language of Aotearoa. I'll paraphrase what I said for you. As is our custom, I first announced my intention to speak, and I did that with words that translate as follows. Write it in the sky, write it in the land, write it in the hearts of all people. The most important thing is love and compassion. I then greeted the Sky Father Ranginui above and the Earth Mother Papatua Nuku below. I then greeted Ngāti Whātua, the tribe that holds customary authority over the lands on which we're gathered today. As I'm from the Waikato Confederation of Tribes, I acknowledged our newly appointed leader, Kuini Ngā Waihono I te pō. After that, I acknowledged her father and the late monarch, Tuheitia Pōtatau Te Whirowhiro Te Tuawhitu, and others have also left us in recent times, and farewelled them all. In the Māori world, we believe that our ancestors are never that far away from us. I then turned to us, the living, and I sent you my greetings as we gather today at the 2024 Postgraduate Research Symposium. This is, my friends, the story of an accidental academic. A PhD was never in the game plan, and actually there never was an academic game plan. My path to tertiary education, let alone a PhD, has been a fairly meandering path littered with a few large and hairy obstacles. But here I am, proof that large and hairy obstacles can be overcome, and that equally large and hairy pieces of research do finally come to an end. And sometimes they turn into this, a book. More on this later. I grew up on the North Shore of Auckland, Te Raki Pai Whenua, with my two younger brothers, Keith and Brad, who are both gorgeous men. Our Māori Pākehā dad, Ron, was a carpenter, and our mum, Faye, a migrant from Australia in the mid-1960s, was a secretary. They came from shattered families and periods in care, and to think of what they endured still can make me really sad. But Mum and Dad knew that without family support or social capital, all they had were their hands, and boy, they were super hard workers. Work meant survival, work meant choices, work meant security. We three kids laugh long and loud about the completely overdeveloped Middleton work ethic we inherited, but we remain eternally grateful that Mum and Dad gave us the secure childhood that they never had. When we were growing up, our mother's favourite phrase was, "There's no such word as can't." Her attitude was that we had to persevere until we worked it out, whether it was trying to tie a shoelace or patching up a squabble with a playmate. Sometimes it was utterly infuriating to hear that all the time, but she was not for tuning. And 99.9% of the time, we could tie that shoelace or we could patch up that squabble. Dear old Dad, born in 1939 and bearing the attitudes of that era, had a less lovely quote. As I grew up, he said often, "Women aren't worth educating because they just get married and have babies." This opinion, often expressed in front of me, infuriated my poor mother. She grew up in a notorious Catholic orphanage that wasn't kind and wasn't safe, but the nuns did give their charges a thorough basic education, and Mum believed wholeheartedly in the power of education. When we were small, she put a lot of time and energy into supporting our learning. As soon as I could string a sentence together, I started writing epics, I tell you. When I was 7 or 8, Mum became my first publisher, typing out my 3-sentence epics on her typewriter. For me, the written word was an amazing treasure through which I could record my thoughts, hear the thoughts of others, and immerse myself in other worlds. However, in my teens, my father announced that I had to leave school at the minimum school leaving age of 15 and get a job. Large, hairy obstacle number 1. Now that was really disappointing as I absolutely loved learning. Mum was utterly furious. There was a hissed conversation behind closed doors. The upshot was that I was allowed to do year 12 or 6th form as it was then, but that was it. So while my peers polished their essay writing skills in their last year of school, I was going door to door around North Shore businesses selling computer consumables. I am not sure I was any good at it at all, but Dad was happy. However, while I was traipsing around small businesses, a plan was forming. I had studied journalism in my 6th form year at school, and I had my eye on a 6-month Introduction to Journalism course held right here at AUT, or Auckland Technical Institute, as it was then. The course required an aptitude test and an interview. I was lucky to get in, and even luckier to get a cadetship, a sort of apprenticeship, on the Sunday Star Times newspaper. I spent the next 6 years building my skills and saving money so I could go to university. There's no such word as can't. And as an aside, look at those hoop earrings. I was the poster child for the 80s. I don't know what happened to them. Now, for 3 of those 6 years, I lived in the United Kingdom, working in newspapers and magazines. Mum, now newly single, came to visit twice. On the second visit, I told her I was ready to come home and go to university. She was as excited about this as I was and came home ahead of me to buy a house that we could share while I studied. That pic was taken on her last day with me in England. 3 months later, on the day I got off the plane back in Auckland, aged 23, I was met with devastating news. While I was in the air, my lovely mum had died by suicide. There was no note. My family imploded, as you might imagine. The months that followed were indescribably painful and chaotic. I thought my academic career was over, before it had begun. But as the time to enrol, or not enrol, arrived, I asked myself, what would Mum want me to do? The answer was clear. There's no such word as can't. That first year at the University of Auckland was hard, juggling part-time journalism, study, and the continuing fallout from Mum's death. Thank you. I didn't cry during any of the rehearsals, honest. Bear with me. That first year, as I said, was difficult. And the fallout was huge, as it often is when there's a suicide in a family. I also lacked many of the academic skills I needed. I was often told that my essays were way too journalistic. Now, as you know, in an essay, you marshal your arguments, then come to a conclusion. In journalism, you start with the main finding or the main point and put the less important information underneath. I can tell you now that just did not fly at uni. But I asked some friends for help and kept on plugging away. 3 years later, I had a BA in English. I was content with that. University study done. I went back to journalism. Fast forward to 2003. Dear old dad has died after 3 years of battling cancer, which has been just awful to witness. I'm a 33-year-old senior writer on the New Zealand Herald when another one of those annoying, hairy obstacles pops up. I become the cancer patient. Advanced bowel cancer that has spread. Surgery and 7 months of chemotherapy followed. Being forced to face your mortality before you're ready for it, I can tell you, is really no fun. But during those long months of treatment, there was time to think about what I really wanted out of life. There was a hole in my life. The knowledge of my whakapapa, my reo, and my tikanga. I knew I was Māori, but Dad wasn't connected to his whakapapa. He had been raised in the Pākehā world and had resolutely stayed there. If you consider the attitudes to Māori in that era, it's actually not at all surprising. Mum used to say, look, your dad doesn't know much about his Māori heritage and he doesn't really want to know. You should be proud of your Māori heritage, but if you want to find out about it, you'll probably have to do that yourself. The decision was made. It was time to learn more about the Māori me. You know, there's no such word as can't. To free myself up to study te reo and tikanga part-time and spend more time at my marae, I set up my own business in communications and journalism. Over a period of 8 years, I studied away, slogged away at times, at both AUT and Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. And I've put that there just to show you a way you might do it if you want to know more about te reo Māori. Now, the final qualification on the slide, the PG Diploma in Arts from AUT, is also the first year of a research master's, and that required a research proposal. Now, I had a subject in mind and did the proposal with no intention of taking it anywhere. At that time, it was just a hoop to jump through. However, a few people got in my ear, and that's when the accident happened. I became a master's student in 2016. A few more months passed, and my research became a PhD. I loved every minute of my PhD, even the really crappy minutes. Right from the beginning, I was clear on what I wanted to research. As you know, I started my working life as an English language newspaper reporter. However, I followed the Māori language news and wondered about the news work I couldn't see, the work that was going on behind the scenes, behind the camera. I knew that Māori ways of seeing, being and doing, which we call tikanga, probably didn't mesh very well with the values embedded in news work, especially those related to deadlines and interviewing and handling people. I also knew that our Māori news was really unusual compared to its state-owned and commercial counterparts. News in te reo Māori is government funded through an agency called Te Māngai Pāho as a result of a tiriti or Waitangi-related settlement related to the protection and promotion of te reo Māori. So I wondered how all those factors I just mentioned influenced how reporters did their jobs. But I was really surprised to find out that there was nothing, no in-depth research about Māori journalism. This is despite the fact that we've had radio news in te reo Māori for Māori since World War II. And the first te reo Māori show, which you might be aware of, Te Karere, is more than 40 years old. So the research question was this: what is the influence of tikanga Māori and the language revitalisation agenda on the practices and perspectives of Māori language journalists? My paradigm was kaupapa Māori, which essentially means research about Māori, by Māori, for Māori, with the Māori worldview, thought, history and language centred. As the method, qualitative interview wouldn't be enough on its own, as what people say they do and what they actually do differ due to social desirability bias, and a lot of you qualitative researchers will be aware of that. So the complement was video ethnography, filming people. In interviews, reporters were asked which elements of tikanga meant the most to them. in their private and their professional lives, and how they felt those values and practices meshed with news work. They discussed how they approached writing their stories and how they handled pinch points between the Anglo-American journalistic model we've inherited here and Māori ways of communicating. So talking technically for a minute, film gives us multimodal data, which means different communication modes such as speech, gesture, gaze, proximity, and posture are all relevant and all analysable. So filming reporters at work gained such rich and deep data on how the reporters were handling the intersections between culture, news work, and the language quality and quantity requirements, which are monitored by the funder. So the data was analysed with the tools and lenses found in critical discourse studies, as well as conversation analysis, intertextual analysis, thematic analysis, and non-verbal analysis. That provides a really broad toolkit with which to make meaning from all kinds of texts. So I'll summarise the findings of my PhD, just briefly. In all democracies, professional journalism is conceived as a mechanism to give people fair, accurate, and balanced information on what's happening in their worlds. These tenets apply to Māori journalism too, but what's different about Māori journalism is that subjects deemed important often differ from that in the mainstream, and the perspective brought to bear is informed by the history, values, and experiences shared by Māori. So common topics are tiriti issues, especially in the current political environment, how we combat racism, the health of our people, the land, the seas and the air, the maintenance of te reo Māori and tikanga, kapahaka, Māori achievement, Māori sport, Māori in sport. Tikanga is process-driven and relationship-driven. News is time and output-driven. In the Māori world, tikanga drives relationships, and the correct process is far more important than the clock. So, for example, pulling people out of a ritual in order to meet a deadline risks rebuke, and journalists have to balance those competing demands all the time. So in the Māori world, there is a social imperative to treat people with care and concern for their well-being, which we call manaakitanga. Journalists tended to avoid aggressive approaches or polemical he said, she said writing. That was seen as unnecessary to get a story and tell a story, and it also risked impairing relationships. We're all related after all. But journalists still pose the hard questions because that is their job. But it was important to do so in a way that maintained both parties' mana, or dignity. However, balancing the demands of news work and the principles of tikanga also brought cognitive dissonance. This is the discomfort that arises when what you are conditioned to do and what you have to do are sitting at odds. Many of the journalists talked about their work and its intersection with their identity, using the metaphor of wearing a Māori hat and a journalism hat. The Māori hat was permanently affixed, but the journalism hat came off at the end of the day. So I have a favourite part of my thesis, and you guys will probably find that you end up with a favourite part too. My favourite part was the part of my PhD that deals with te reo Māori and how journalists take the oral arts of the Māori language world and adapt them for news. Now here is a really simple example. It happened in about 2016. A young woman went to the Gold Coast on holiday, where she hooked up through Tinder with a man. Some hours after they met, she suffered a fatal fall from the balcony of his apartment. Now, in her script, the reporter, Peata Melbourne, needed to say the night she died. She could have simply said, te pō, oopsie, wrong one. She could have simply said, te pō e mate aia, which is the literal translation of the night she died. But instead she wrote, he pō tūtaki ia hine nui te pō, or the night she met hine nui te pō, who is the goddess of death. Now the allusion to Māori ears is very elegant and very Māori. If you speak te reo, you know who hine nui te pō is and how she became the goddess of death. It's quite a long and convoluted story. The many layers of meaning and the myth messages in that story are evoked, but they don't need to be stated, adding great richness to the reporting. My thesis also looked at the constraints posed by the fact that Māori language news is funded for language outcomes, not journalistic or information goals, which is a little bit of an issue that does need to be sorted out. The strategic perspective is that news in Te Reo Māori has to be part of a language-scape that promotes revitalisation. However, news stories have to be each 70 to 100% in Te Reo, and the funding body measures the quality and the quantity of journalist language. Now, as you can imagine, this percentage goal presents a really big challenge, as just 34% of the Māori population can speak Te Reo fairly well, and this is self-reported, and just 8% of the population. So as a journo, if the people with the information are fluent speakers, fabulous, sorted. But more often than not, the people with the information you need are either learning Te Reo or are monolingual. Reporters can interview in English and increase the reo quotient through their links and their voiceovers, but to keep the percentage up, to keep the funders happy, and to demonstrate Te Reo in use, they need to encourage those who have some reo to use it. One of the journalists in my research, Kiriyama Wright, said this. Do we have audio here? No, I'll read out what he said. You're not there to get the story, you're there to empower someone to be able to deliver the message in their native tongue. What's not on there, but what he said after that is, I grew up with my parents learning Te Reo Māori as a second language, so I understand the importance of supporting people to deliver their message in Te Reo Māori. So overall, reporters were less worried about interviewees' language accuracy than their ability to convey a message. Notably, they didn't judge others' language abilities. They were well aware that whakamā or shame can be a major issue for adults with an imperfect grasp of their heritage language, and they saw encouraging those people as part of their role. So speaking academically for a sec, they took what language revitalisation academics call a liberal/compromising approach. They placed value on the language being spoken, and errors were less important than the ability to convey a message. For them, a spoken language is a living language. PhD in a pipi shell, essentially journalists working in Te Reo have a really delicate balancing act between the tenets of journalism, remaining true to their tikanga, and meeting the requirements of the funder. In this, they're juggling a lot more than their mainstream counterparts. And I can tell you, having been an English language journalist for most of my career, it's hard enough without having to add another language in and add in all of the supporting others. It's a big job. Now, I didn't do my PhD intending to be an academic. Remember, there was no game plan. But a job arose at the School of Communication Studies as I was finishing, and I got it. I learned a lot there and did some work I'm really proud of, including helping staff and students get their heads around what it means to live by Te Tiriti o Waitangi and supporting people in their reo. I also prioritised publishing papers that the journalism school here needed, because as you can imagine, with no research into Māori language journalism, there were no papers or resources for the journalism school. However, after a couple of years, I decided an academic life wasn't for me. Self-employment suits my interests better, so I returned to paddling my own waka. However, I do remain a member of 2 research centres here at AUT, Journalism, Media and Democracy, which we call JMAD, and Torua Centre for Communication Research, both based in the School of Communication Studies. So these days, I have what you'd call a portfolio career. 2 days a week are spent doing communication advisory for Middleton Group, the sustainable engineering company founded in Melbourne by my brother Keith, who was also an AUT graduate back in the day when it was ATI. He leads 85 of us and growing on a mission to protect the planet by electrifying everything via renewable energy. There is, after all, no planet B. My job is to tell the stories of our people, our values-led culture and our projects, and support our multicultural team on any of their communication needs. On the other 3 days, I write fiction in Te Reo Māori for adults. There's very little original fiction in Te Reo Māori for people to read, and that's a gap that needs to be filled. I've been really lucky this year to secure grants to work with a mentor, and that partnership has been really, really fruitful. Now, there's a question that hasn't yet been answered. How do we get from this to this? In truth, I wasn't thinking about writing a book until my thesis was nearly finished. Then it became clear that with a bit of a rewrite, it could fill in a gap in the educational and general market. So I had an existing relationship with Huia Publishers in Wellington, as the company had published several of my short stories. So once the thesis was done, I sent it down to Huia for its decision-making to assess nervous weight. Then they said, yes, go ahead, and I had to rewrite it for a general and educational market. Now, as you know, in a thesis, you show what you know, and that means a literature review, explaining your methodology, and carrying out deep analyses. For a book aimed at a general audience, there's no longer any need for that. I had the PhD, so I was able to position myself as a well-informed author. So the methodology went, the literature review was condensed, and the socio-linguistic analyses were turned into narratives. Māori news comes in both English and Te Reo Māori, so I expanded the focus of the book to cover both. The thesis had been deliberately written to be accessible, journalist at the end of the day, so the rewriting wasn't too onerous. To appeal to a general market, pictures were needed, and that's what took time. I had to go around media outlets, the National Library, and individual photographers to either beg or buy pictures. The only ones that had to be purchased were those from the National Library. Other organisations waived fees because they saw their pictures as a koha to the kaupapa. So in January this year, the book was launched at Waiahorotu Marae here at AUT. That was a joyful day. 1,500 copies have been printed, and there's also an ebook, and from what I hear, they're selling well. And what's been most pleasing is that libraries have been big supporters. There are, I'm told, in the Auckland Public Library system, 29 hard copies, which means that the book is accessible to everyone. For me, accessibility is key. So today, as I talk to you, I'm 54. From starting my undergraduate degree to my PhD was a 26-year journey. I look back now and see that while I've never had an academic plan, I also haven't been afraid to take opportunities when they opened up or presented themselves. Mum's motto, there's no such word as can't, has most definitely sunk in. And as my fabulous husband Andrew, sitting here, has often reminded me, having to work around the law of dad taught me some good problem-solving skills early on. Now, resilience is a necessary part of the PhD toolkit. The road is long, and as you know, when you start your research, the destination isn't always 100% clear. In my experience, and that of people around me, the resilience to not just survive but thrive during PhD study is made up of a number of things, many of which you can influence. So here then is a non-exhaustive list of the tools and attitudes I think are useful in a PhD toolkit. Now, a risk in research is perceived isolation, feeling that no one understands what you're doing, and actual isolation, distancing yourself from peers or supervisors. These can turn into a vicious circle. To break that, find your tribe. That is, like-minded people to accompany you on the PhD journey. My tribe was a group called Maiki Aronui, the AUT arm of a national network for Māori and Indigenous scholars. And in it, I've made friends for life. Woo! One of the leaders of Maiki Aronui is hiding at the back, Debs. There are many such support groups, and the GRS can direct you to them. Good communication with supervisors is critical, and you do have a role in establishing and maintaining a good relationship. Take an active part in establishing that relationship. My supervisors and I worked well as a trio because we were very clear on our respective roles right from the start. As I knew my own work ethic and my work habits, I was able to say to them, this is what I'll need to work effectively, and they responded positively to that. Treat your research as your job. Be disciplined with your time. That said, remember that research is part of your life, not your whole life. Keep in touch with friends, get enough rest and exercise, and trust that your subconscious will still be tuning away usefully in the background. Also, don't be afraid to ask your family to step up and to help reduce the domestic load while you're doing your PhD. It's important to stress to those around you that the extra load isn't permanent, it's temporary. If you spend too much time going down tangential but very enjoyable alleyways, of which I am so guilty, do what I did as a remedy. Write out your research question and stick it at eye level. For me, it was at the top of my computer screen. Then every time you look up, you're gently reminded to check whether you're staying in your lane. Can't say this enough, make use of the GRS workshops. I had quite a few holes in my knowledge about research tools and various software programs when I came to do my PhD, all remedied through GRS workshops. For example, in journalism, I'd used specialised software for years, and when I started my PhD, my Microsoft skills were pretty basic. The single most useful GRS workshop I did was the one that teaches you how to format Word documents into thesis style. Trust me, yes. Trust me, when your first draft ends up at a ridiculous 130,000 words, as mine did, you need to know this stuff. For qualitative researchers, remember that people are not merely data points. When you enter into a relationship with an informant, with informants, build it as if the relationship is to be a permanent one, as we do in the Māori world. Also, keep your participants informed of your progress, maybe an email every 6 months or so to let them know what's going on. In the Māori world, we say, no mai te hapa. Embrace your mistakes, welcome your mistakes. From mistakes we learn, lean into them. If something goes wrong, either personal or research, don't suffer in silence. Seek help early. AUT has excellent support systems for this, for students. Also, try not to compare yourself to others. You are unique, and so is your doctoral journey. Those who pursue PG study are privileged. Make sure that you direct some of your good fortune into giving something back. I hope that somewhere in what I've said today, I've given each of you something for your PhD toolkit. There's just one last thing to say. There's no such word as can't. You can and you will. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Atukohu ngā mihi nui ki a koe, thank you very much. You mentioned that you hoped there might be a few pieces of information of some help to people in the audience. Now, my view is that you have just dropped us with a vast array of just exquisitely useful knowledge and experience, and it was a real privilege to hear your journey. I know about you, I've known of you, I didn't know your full journey, so it was lovely to see your journey and certainly very inspiring to see where you have come to now. So thank you. So while we have Atukohu captive right here, I've got the microphone and we'll flick around. And does anyone have any questions for Atukohu on her journey or anything else around dealing, well, not just with your PhD, but really just fire away?
I'm a pretty open book, so, you know, there's some quite personal stuff in there. I'm quite happy to address some of it.
That one, thanks.
I think I'm mic'd, aren't I?
That's right, yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes, you can. All right.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. It's such a involved, research. Did you have any particular challenges around the ethics that you would have needed to obtain?
Yes, the interesting thing about ethics is obviously I've never had to fill an ethics form before, and I found that it was quite strict about, say, a safety plan. And I did have to point, and I understand why that's necessary, but I did have to point out that I was interviewing people in their places of work usually. So I think it's useful when you go into putting your ethics proposal together, think really long and wide and sort of think about preempting. So think, where might the questions come and see if you can preempt those. Like it hadn't even occurred to me that the office might require a safety plan. And so I put one together. But yeah, one of the things that I don't know what the story is now, but I think it's always useful to have examples to work off. So I did actually ask a couple of people if I could have a look at the ethics application, because when you're doing it for the first time, it's not necessarily obvious what's required. So, but yes, I think try and preempt that, because otherwise you'll slow things down. And often by the time you get into your ethics application, you really want to get moving. So try and assemble everything beforehand. Go and see if you can look at other people's. Maybe have an informal catch-up and say, okay, what do people usually forget? And I'll try and do it now. So yeah, take an active approach to managing it. Everything else was fairly straightforward. Obviously, at the time you're filling out your ethics application, you don't necessarily know what your questions are going to be and where things are going to be, but you just need to give a coherent account to cover off all the potential ethics queries. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Ko Jessica Warshell toko ingoa.
Kia ora.
I'm just finishing up my PhD, and
Yay.
so I'm very inspired by your work and the work you're doing, and also looking at this space. I mean, I guess now you've transitioned out of the academic space. So part of the question was looking at, you talked about there was minimal sort of publications in your field, in your area. So how have you seen that with your work grow, and as you're continuing in the research space, what does it mean to actually continue to put this information out in an academic context and build up that platform?
Well, it's good that you know that young journalists to be getting the best possible information because you've put it out there for them. And let's face it, we all love looking at download statistics and seeing the number go up. I know, because it's easy to find out, that when you can see your papers on reading lists, that makes you feel that it's all been worthwhile. And that's what's important to me, because the problem is in a lack of information, people tend to make stuff up. So I wanted to be able to say, look, this is how it actually works. One of the papers that I know is really useful is one where I followed Shannon Honey-Thompson for New Zealand and did a paper that itemised, basically did a deep dive into her output for an entire day when she was reporting on a treaty settlement. So I basically followed her every day and got all of her scripts, all of her audio, and basically analysed how she treated that from mainstream radio with a Māori lens. And the thing about these sorts of papers, journalism is culturally contextualised. So whenever you talk about, say, how Māori journalism works, you get a chance to talk about the social conditions around it. So I found it, so when you're reading about how this journalist reports on a Treaty of Waitangi settlement, you're learning about that particular iwi whose settlement it is. You're learning about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. You're learning a bit about Māori history. So you get to weave all this cultural context into it as well. So I like to think that people are taking away more than they otherwise might. But yeah, I'm really happy with those papers because I deliberately did the foundational papers first. So I did the ones that I thought were most needed, the broad ones, and I'm hoping that they're useful to journalists going out there, because up until we have, as far as I know, this is the case last year, there are no Māori journalism educators in New Zealand at the moment. There are no teachers in journalism schools who are Māori. So how else do the students get that exposure? I also hear that noho marae are not as common as they used to be. So how do students get that exposure? If you don't live in a Māori world in your private life, it's often your work or your education that puts you in contact. But what if you don't have that? So yeah, trying to be practical, trying to think about what would have helped me when I was a young journalist. Because certainly when I did my journalism training, it was all about, it was about the skills. It wasn't about thinking about the role of the journalist in society. And certainly we had we weren't given any particular insight into the Māori world. Kia ora.
Hello, Ata.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Yes. Kia ora.
So I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that I've known you since you started your journey with us at AUT, and I just wanted to say how proud and how inspiring you are, and it's just been a privilege to be part of that journey. And you're one of the reasons why I love what I do and why we love what we do is seeing our students thrive and out there inspiring people and changing the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. For those of you who haven't had a lot to do with GRS yet, you will probably meet the lovely Jessie at some point. She is one of the people who keeps us on track and keeps our PhDs going through the process. Thank you, Jessie. Any last requests?
So Jess, I just want to tell Toko what you've just said on behalf of GRS. Atakohu, proud and inspired are two words that always come to mind when we have dealt with you over a number of years, and that is certainly something that we've seen today in this keynote presentation. So ngā mihi nui, my colleague. And on behalf of the university and the Graduate Research School in particular, like to present you with this
Oh.
to say thank you.
Kia ora.
And it's lovely to see you again.
Oh. Kia ora tātou.